Greetings everyone, and welcome back to Lucas Brews. In today's video, we're going to have a build of the IBG 1/72nd scale Type 95 Ha-Go, a Japanese light tank. And I'm doing this, and I'm actually doing two of these kits, but I'll only be doing one. And therefore, a little project I've got planned about doing a stop motion around the Battle of Milne Bay, which was a little battle that happened in New Guinea that was quite important during World War II that's kind of been forgotten. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and also the Type 95 in general at the end of this video. And there's a little link in the description to Tectonic Hobbies where you can buy this IBG kit and many others. And we're also a little store on the Sunshine Coast, so please be sure to drop in if you live there or are visiting at any point. But anyways, without further ado, let's get into it. Upon opening the box, you are greeted with a lovely set of glossy instructions, 6 sprues moulded in dark grey, and a set of decals and some very nice photo etch. I began assembly with the hull and the running gear. First of all, I used a set of sprue cutters to remove the parts I needed from the sprue, and then I used a filing stick to remove some of the excess sprue and make the surfaces nice and smooth. I glued into position some small pieces that are designed to attach the idler and the sprocket, probably some sort of final drive cover on the front section of the vehicle, and then I glued the rear plate at the bottom of the hull into position. The detail on the hull is really nice. As you can see, there's some raised rivet details and also some nice recessed panel lines. I also glued in place one of the towing shackles on the rear of the tank and then began assembling the actual running gear. The tracks are moulded as a single piece of hard plastic, and then all of the individual road wheels, the return rollers and the sprocket and idler come as separate parts. To assemble the track, you basically glue the first half of the idler, the road wheels and the return rollers onto the chassis, and then you take the two sprocket halves and glue them to the track so they lock up with the teeth. Then you can glue the sprockets to the rest of the chassis, and once the track's in position and lined up with the other wheels, you can then put the second of the road wheels, return rollers and the idlers, or the second half of them, onto the chassis, which will then lock the tracks into place. I really like how this assembly goes, even though it's a little bit fiddly. Because the tracks are made out of half plastic, they're very nicely detailed, and since they're not moulded as one piece like you'd get in a lot of other kits, you've still got that extra detail for all the road wheels, which I think is pretty important with this kit because they're so visible and large relative to the rest of the tank. I cut out the road wheels, which come moulded to their bogies and in two separate sections, with a front half and then a rear half. I glued the halves together before then gluing them onto the chassis. The detail on them was really quite excellent and they fitted really well to the rest of the tracks. With the running gear completed, it was then time to move on to the upper hull. I glued into position a small little bit of engine detail which is glued to an area where a hatch is on the upper hull before pressing the two sections of the tank together. I then cut out the smaller details for the hull, then glued them to the rest of the tank. This included a plate for the upper area where the turret ring is, a small bulge where the machine gun is housed for the assistant driver, and also another little section where the driver's hatch is. However, I decided to leave the driver's hatch off. I then glued the turret together, gluing the bottom of the turret, and then gluing into position the gun. The gun has some pretty nice detail, including a little bit of internal stuff so you could have the hatches open. There's then an extra little plate on the back of the turret that houses the other machine gun, and then while that was drying, I glued on the exhausts and some of the finer details such as the headlights, before then gluing the two machine guns into place. I was a little disappointed that the machine gun that goes into the rear of the turret didn't have any internal details for the inside of the turret like the cannon barrel did, but I assume it was just because the cannon barrel was designed like that for balance. I then used a little bit of blue tack to hold the exhaust cover and the commander's hatch into position so that they could be painted without moving, and then it was time to paint the model. I painted 4 coats of Tamiya XF58 olive green over the entire of the hull and the turret, making sure to apply the paint with a little bit of water to help thin it out and make sure that I applied it as much as possible in the same direction. Both of these techniques will help reduce visible brush strokes. You definitely want to thin the Tamiya paints. You can use either a lacquer for the acrylics or you can just use a little bit of water, which is what I use. You're sort of aiming to get the consistency so that the paint will flow relatively easily, but not too thick that it will end up being all gloopy and you'll start to see brush strokes. But at the same time, you don't want to go too thin and have the paint not really stick to the model and sort of just puddle away. I use a relatively large brush also when doing this to help reduce the brush strokes, since you'll have to make less passes and the paint will then as a result be nice and uniform. When I'm painting the model, I'll also paint it in sections so that I can hold it easily. You'll notice I paint the hull separate to the tracks and the side parts and the running gear, and this is because I like to use the tracks as a handle when I'm painting the hull, and then vice versa. I do a similar trick with the turret, but instead I hold it by the cannon barrel when I want to paint the body, or by the small notches at the base of the turret which are designed to lock it to the hull. For the rest of the camouflage pattern, rather than referring to the instructions, I have a look at some pictures of restored Type 95s, one of which is also from the Australian War Memorial and was in fact present at the Battle of Milne Bay before it ran off of the road and into some mud and got stuck and was then later captured. The next colour I decide to do is the sort of distinctive reddish brown colour. I decide that XF9 Hull Red is probably the best match. Generally I'll use this colour for the red primer that's common on German tanks, sometimes mixing it with a little bit of red if I want to make it a bit more red, but in this case I was quite happy with how it turned out as it is. I apply it using a relatively fine brush, very carefully, and sort of following line patterns just like on the reference photos. I keep the paint nice and thin and do around about 2 coats of this darker colour. Generally the darker the colour is, the less coats you'll need, however 2 or 3 is generally a nice amount to go with. After the 2 coats of Hull Red have dried, I then get out some Tamiya XF3 Flat Yellow and apply the yellow pattern markings in a pretty similar fashion. You'll see that I made it a little bit thick there and then had to thin it down with a little bit of water. I wanted the yellow to not be too strong and sort of have an almost faded kind of painted on effect, since it wasn't too uncommon for these vehicles to be painted in the field by hand, and rather than using an airbrush in a factory, which would mean that they'd look pretty messy and you probably would see a few paint streaks and marks on them. I'd be very interested to hear what you guys reckon about my painting of the Japanese camouflage. I thought it was a little bit strange painting yellow onto a tank. Obviously it's probably more designed to replicate light and shade so that it's harder to spot them through the jungle from the air rather than on the ground, since you can generally tell when a tank's driving through a jungle as it'll make a lot of noise and probably be knocking a few trees and things out of the way. But from my reference photos, the paint does appear to be very yellow, even though I did consider a desert yellow or a darker yellow more similar to the German standard kind of yellow. I decided to still go with the flat yellow. Anyways, camouflage aside, it was then time to paint some of the finer details. I used a little bit of Vallejo silver to paint the steel tracks. Later on I darken them a little bit and also add some weathering effects to make them look a little bit rusty and also quite dirty. I used a pretty fine brush to do this because since the tracks were moulded as one piece and it was a bit tricky to paint them before they went on, I had to sort of paint them around the road wheels. I also used the silver to paint the machine gun barrels and some of the other finer details such as the lights and the tools at the back of the tank. Once I'd painted both sets of tracks, I then used a little bit of Vallejo flat black to paint the rubber on the outside of the road wheels. The reason I chose Vallejo for these parts was because I had some in that specific colour, and I do find that the Vallejo pigments tend to be a lot nicer quality, meaning you're less likely to get imperfections in the paint and they're a little bit smoother and easier to apply when compared to the Tamiya, but both paints are honestly really quite good brands and I highly recommend them if you're like me and enjoy brush painting over airbrushing. I then used a fine brush to go over the yellow one more time since I thought it was a little bit too faded, and also I'd overpainted it a little bit with some of the black and the silver. With the camouflage all neatened up, I then got a little bit of Tamiya red brown and thinned it with a lot of water so that it would only flow into the gaps, and effectively used it as a pin wash to create some rusting effects on the tracks. A little bit of Tamiya Titan Gold was painted onto the exhaust system, very carefully around some of the latches that hold it in place, and then I used a little bit of flat earth and some silver to paint the pioneering tools. I painted the mesh cover for the exhaust and the small shroud with a little bit of XF9 Hull Red. I did around about 3 coats on the special photo etch parts before later cutting them out and then gluing them with a bit of super glue into place. But before I did that, I decided to weather the model first. The first step of weathering for me is to apply a little bit of XF16 flat aluminium to create some metal chipping effects. To do this, I use a relatively fine brush and make sure the paint is nice and dry so that it does not flow and instead only forms on the surfaces that I'm tapping, so that it effectively only appears on the raised areas which would have been more exposed to getting chipped over time. I also focus on areas where there are hatches or crew are likely to walk, on accesses for stowage bins, and also on the edges of armoured panels which would be exposed to things like bushes or debris as the tank is driving around. Once the metal chipping has dried very nicely, I then get out some Tamiya Panel Liner Ascent Black and apply it all over the running gear and the tracks to help darken them and give a shading effect and make them look a bit weathered, and also to highlight the details. I also apply it onto some of the hatches and the access ports, and some areas such as the vents where there are some extra details that would also be quite likely to build up a little bit of dirt and grease over time because of the mechanical components of the vehicle, and also just from a little bit of shading. Once I've applied the panel liner, I then use a little bit of enamel thinner once it is dried to remove some of the excess from the hatches. Unfortunately at this point my camera was a little bit out of focus, but basically I apply it using a fine brush and rub it onto the areas where I want to remove the excess panel liner to lighten it up, and since the thinner also helps thin it out, it will then help it conform more to the sunken details. Next I add some mud and grass effects by Vallejo using a cocktail stick to try and push the mud and grass effect into the mud guards and the areas around the running gear, and also on the underside of the tanks in areas where the tracks are likely to flick up mud and grass and get it stuck on the tank. I also apply it all over the tracks themselves to help make them look a little bit dirty. Next I get out my Tamiya Weathering Master. I use set B to apply some of their rust colour onto the exhaust system, and after dabbing it on using a fine brush and a little bit of water to help make the mixture nice and thick, I then also apply it onto parts of the grille and on some of the metal chipping areas that are a little bit more exposed to create a bit of a rusty kind of mud effect. I also streak it down the rear of the vehicle, and after it's dried I then apply a little bit of black onto the exhaust pipe to create some exhaust smoke, and also I add a little bit coming out of some of the engine hatches to create some engine oil leaks and grime. Next I get out Weathering Set A and I apply some light sand pretty much over the entire of the mud guards and down the side of the vehicle. Notice how I'll apply it with the brush and then use my finger to wipe some of the excess away. I also apply a little bit of mud effects on the underside of the tank and in areas where I want it to be darker, and a little bit more extra sand onto the areas that are lighter. The sand is good for simulating dried mud and dirt, while the mud effects are obviously a little bit better for more wet mud. The weathering powders are pretty versatile and can be used to create a number of effects. You can either dry brush them on to help highlight details and add dirt in raised areas, or you can mix them with a little bit of water to make them nice and thick and create some pretty thick and very heavy textures. Once I'm done with the weathering powders, I then cut the photo etch parts out of their frame, and using a little bit of Deluxe Materials Rocket CA glue, I glue the mesh cover for the exhaust and the other smaller cover near the engine vent into place. Following this, I then get out a fine brush and apply a little bit of Tamiya Clear Red onto the rear formation light at the back of the tank, and then after using a little bit of Revell Contactor Professional to glue the plastic Pioneer tools into place, the Ha-Go was finally complete. And here you can see the finished model. So overall I was really happy with this kit. It goes together really well, the details are very good, and the photo etching is a nice little touch as well. I'm not sure I'm happy with the camouflage scheme that I went with. I think it may be a little bit too bright, but it's a bit tricky to get some good references on the colour of Japanese tanks. I highly recommend having a go at this one. The Type 95 is a pretty interesting and historically significant tank. It was Japan's main tank that they had during World War II. They had around about 2,000 or so that they built, but they'd originally designed it in the 1930s, so obviously by the time of the Pacific War it was a little bit outclassed by the Shermans that it would end up going against. If you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the history of the Type 95 and Japanese tank development during World War II in general, then I highly recommend you check out Potential History and also the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, as they do some pretty good videos on the topic. As I mentioned, I built 2 of these tanks, and therefore a Battle of Milne Bay film project that I'm looking at starting at the early part of next year, so stay tuned for that. But otherwise, this is definitely a really good kit, and I'd highly recommend you get it if you're interested in Japanese armour. Thank you so much for having a little watch of this video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, and feel free to leave any suggestions, any questions or other things you want to leave in the comment section down below. And a big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund this video and my other projects. As I mentioned, these tanks were built for a project I've got planned about the Battle of Milne Bay, so keep aware for any news I have on that, but like I said, it probably won't be until around about next year that I start on that. I've been doing a fair few projects in terms of animations, just shorter ones, because they're quite popular and I have a lot of fun making them too. But yeah, so stay tuned for that and other videos, and until the next one, model on.